Now, I don't have any slides, so don't worry that there's been a technical glitch when they don't appear on the screen. Before I begin, I want to offer issue a word of warning and of reassurance. The warning is that my topic requires me to start this talk on a somewhat cynical note, but I want to reassure you that in true Hugo-esque spirit, that we might first have to mire ourselves in the miserable, we will do so only so that ultimately we can rise up in a spirit of utopian optimism. The particular miserableness with which I am concerned, having been a teacher for the last 25 years, is this. I believe our children are leading spiritually barren lives. The schools I see fail utterly to address this problem. Neither the conventional institutions nor the advocates of reform can claim depth of soul as central to their pedagogical purpose. What I recall from my own schooling is a lot of tedious worksheet-based lessons and trivial material to be memorized for a test and then forgotten forever. I learned very little history, and certainly not from teachers who knew and felt the power of the subject to illuminate the course of progress and offer prescriptions for a flourishing future. The science I learned felt more like preparation for a cruise ship trivia contest than it did the unlocking of powerful explanatory principles. I read few works of great literature, and when I did, they were tediously dissected into literary devices. Never did I have a reverent and passionate book lover show me the power of literature to elevate you above the everyday, to stir your soul, and to expand your emotional and intellectual horizons. In my view, education is, in its essence, an activity of soul stretching. What we ought to be doing is harvesting the greatest wisdom of the past, distilling it down to its most potent and life-promoting lessons, and, with earnest conviction of its value, transmitting it to our students. Little about my education or that of this generation seems like it has to do with wisdom or the soul. I'm certainly not alone in bemoaning the state of education, but I also find little to give me hope in the cries I hear for change. What are the solutions we hear proposed most often to the problem of education? Some variety of the following. We were all bored by school. It didn't serve us. Let's do away with all that mindless and oppressive tedium and set our students free, making school instead a playground of liberated creativity and opportunities for self-expression. Or, the world is a mess. We need our schools to focus on fixing all of our present societal pet peeves. We don't need scholars, but citizens who are steeped in our current controversies and can be our agents for change. Or, forget the stuffy, impractical liberal arts. The future is tech. We should teach our children science, math, engineering, robotics, and business and entrepreneurial skills so they are equipped to compete in a tech-based global economy. Or, our children need learn nothing in particular. They just have to learn how to learn. Everything they need to know can be found on the internet. So the schools are failing our students. But now there's a new problem that makes things much worse. In the past decade, this spiritual barrenness of childhood has been amplified, compounded, and catalyzed by smartphones and social media. Have any of you seen the recent statistics about how much time the average, I think this is American teenager, but I'm not sure, might be worldwide, spends daily on entertainment-based screen time? So not screen time at school, entertainment-based screen time. Anyone want to hazard a guess? 3.5 hours. Do I have a higher bid? 7. So a few years ago, pre-COVID, it was 7 hours and 22 minutes. It's now over 8 hours a day. One of my colleagues at VanDamme Academy has contended for many years that someday we'll look at smartphones as we do cigarettes. That used to sound like a crazy Luddite conspiracy theory, but now when he says it, most people nod their heads in unconflicted agreement. So the stretched metaphorical connection I've found between this conference's theme and my own concerns is this. I view today's teenagers as drowning in a soulless digital sea. And bold as the claim might be, I earnestly believe that a rescuing hand can be proffered by Victor Hugo. How smartphones and social media have wreaked havoc on our children's souls is beyond the scope of this talk, but I want to just indicate a few hazards that I can bear witness to. First, children who spend endless hours scrolling through social media posts, YouTube shorts, shopping options, are positively mired in the mundane, banal, and inspirationless monotony. Their existence is confined to one low plane of cliche ideas, crude comedy, and empty consumerism. In my more hyperbolic moods, I think of them as existing in a self-induced spiritual coma, still alive, but without, in any meaningful way, living. Second, constant confrontation with Twitter-style pontificating in 280 words or less precludes nuance, thoughtfulness, and precision. The hit-and-run style of dropping opinions in a comment section undermines young people's opportunity and even capacity for real, compassionate, and nuanced thought. Third, the continuous consumption of all this sophomoric, superficial entertainment stunts their very development of language. That concerns me not because they will perform more poorly on entrance exams, but because it inhibits their ability to think and to know. To expand your repertoire of expression is really to discover new dimensions of life experience, to hone your ability to say things, but also to see them. Fourth, between the sedating effects of continuous scrolling, the neurotic consumption with self-image, and the dopamine-induced craving for endless stuff, children are left with few opportunities to experience transcendence, reverence, or awe. I've been more convinced of the vital human need to be taken out of our petty, everyday concerns than ever, and to be elevated above ordinary cares, to see beyond the profane to the sacred. Those are not experiences to be had from frenetic YouTube gamer videos, TikTok makeup tutorials, or the latest formulaic Netflix series. Fifth, and related to that reverence, is that children need heroes. They need to encounter characters who exemplify virtues so they can call upon them for inspiration, consciously or not, in their own lives. Their smartphones present them with a parade more of clowns and charlatans than of role models. And finally, and in my mind, most importantly, the detached, impersonal, anonymous nature of online life, the tribalization and the polarization that it promotes, and the superficiality and lack of nuance that characterize it are all at odds with the spirit of humanity. Social media has become a platform for impulsive, loud, and compassionless judgment. Curation of news feeds and friend lists means people settle more and more into tribal teams, seeing the world as us versus them, and unable to find, across differences, a common human element. Now, I'm conscious that I have only had time here to give Twitter-length accounts of these problems, but I suspect they will accord with your own observations and experiences. In many ways, I've been immune to the changing tides of culture in my little plot of high ground at VanDamme Academy, the school I founded more than 2 decades ago. For all that time, we've remained a device-free, book-based, paper and pencil school with passionate educators who model rigor and nuance and who create a culture of reverence. And without question, one of the most powerful resources in my repertoire is 93 by Victor Hugo. And that ends the cynical portion of my talk. Now we can let Hugo carry us out of the muck. When I was 24 years old, I took a job as a homeschool teacher to 4 students 10 to 12 years old. It turned out to be a beautiful, almost magical experience that gave me a glimpse of education as it might and ought to be. By far, one of the most memorable experiences of that magical time was reading aloud to my enraptured students Hugo's 93. Every day, we would gather in the living room, cozied up on couches, and I would read the next chapter aloud. Almost from the very opening pages, they were absorbed, transfixed, dazzled. I vividly recall one student saying at the close of a chapter, "Feel my hands." She had been clenching her palms so tightly that they were drenched in sweat. That was 25 years ago, and I've taught 93 almost every year ever since. It's the last book my students read in their 8th grade year, and I consider it the capstone of their VanDamme Academy education. What I hope to share with you today is why I see such profound value to young people in the works of Victor Hugo, why they should be a fixture of every school program, how they can be an answer to the deadening effects of smartphones and social media, and what a lasting impact they leave on my students. Since I spoke to many of you at last year's conference, I know that not even all of you have read 93. But worry not, I will be your guide on a whirlwind tour of it today, and also be giving a recap to those of you who have. This is also the signal to my children to now leave the room, so that they avoid spoilers. My son is going to be reading it next year, so can't ruin the experience. What I want to say right now is that by the end of my talk, if you have not read it and you are not desperate to read it, I will consider myself to have wholly failed in part of my purpose here. The power of this novel is palpable right from chapter 1. This is 93, as in 1793, the bloodiest year in the French Revolution. As the novel opens, a battalion of Republican soldiers are creeping their way through the woods of La Saudre, ever on their guard against ambush. It is a stirring scene that, in retrospect, my students will see hints at the novel's whole theme. I won't suggest what that theme is yet, because Hugo builds to it painstakingly over the course of the novel. But here is what we do see. In this opening scene, two things are powerfully juxtaposed: the ever-present beauty of nature and the sometimes brutal behavior of men. Here's an excerpt. The number of murders that had been committed there was enough to make one's hair stand on end. There was no place more horrible. The soldiers moved forward cautiously. The forest was full of flowers. The men were surrounded by a quivering wall of branches from which the delightful coolness of the leaves descended. Here and there, these green shadows were pierced by sunbeams. On the ground, gladiolas, irises, daffodils, wood daisies, those little flowers which announce fine weather, and vernal crocuses embroidered and braided a carpet of vegetation abounding in every variety of moss, from the kind that looks like chenille cloth to the kind that looks like a star. The soldiers silently advanced step by step, gently pushing aside the underbrush. And then we have a line that sums this all up in one powerful phrase: the birds twittered above their bayonets. I sometimes call Hugo a master distiller of words because of these rhapsodic passages that are then distilled down to a simple essence. Now, what have my teens gained from this experience already? They've been transported away from the banal and the trivial to a world where so much is at stake. From the moment they step into these pages, they can see they have found themselves somewhere grand and significant. With a little guidance from me, they've also begun to conceptualize weighty moral issues and deep philosophic ideas. They don't yet know why Hugo is taking such pains to juxtapose war and nature, but they see that he is, and they sense that he has a purpose. They become curious as to what it all might mean. By only the second page of this novel, they have already experienced Hugo's powerful wielding of words. And because we take the time to discuss, comprehend, and relish them, those words make a lasting impact on my students' souls. I will offer you proof. One year, I taught my 8th grade, so about 13-year-old students, a few sonnet forms, and I asked them to write a sonnet about some scene from any book we had read. One of them chose this scene I just described as her subject, and here's what she wrote. Fresh bloomed flowers are strewn about the ground. Glimpses of the canopied sky are blue. Birds in the trees sing with a cheery sound, for winter's gone, and spring is fresh and new. But we are in the woods of La Saudre, and we won't be fooled by this seeming peace. This terrible forest is where men slay. This white and blue battle may never cease. The bark of the trees is stained dark blood red. These stealthy woods teem with the air of war. Our pounding hearts are filled with only dread. If we are ambushed, we could be no more. Although these woods have found sweet springtime's breath, they hold the wicked air of shadowed death. What the students experience next in the novel is equally stirring. As this Parisian battalion makes its way through the woods, they suddenly hear the sound of breathing in the middle of the thicket, and in a moment, they have surrounded the spot with their muskets pointed at its center. But when one of their scouts looks through the underbrush, she finds not an enemy soldier, but a woman suckling a baby, while two blonde children sleep in her lap. The dialogue that follows is sublime. Radub, the gruff Republican sergeant with his bristling whiskers and eyes that look like glowing coals, interrogates the mother, thinking she might be a spy. Here's an excerpt of their dialogue. "Who are you?" "I don't know." "You don't know who you are?" "We're people who are running away." "Which party do you belong to? Are you a blue? Are you a white? Who are you with?" "I'm with my children." "And what does your husband do, madam? What has become of him?" "Nothing has become of him, because they killed him." "Who?" "I don't know." "What? You don't know who killed your husband? Was it a blue? Was it a white?" "It was a bullet." The cleverness of this dialogue is compelling entirely on its own terms. My students are always awed by it. But at the same time, it introduces them to another dimension of what will ultimately be the novel's profound and moving theme. I help them to penetrate beyond the drama of it, to its moral meaning. This is a novel about the French Revolution, and we would naturally expect the central conflict to be the one put forth by Radub: monarchy versus republic, royalty versus revolution, white versus blue. But with the introduction of this mother, Michelle Fléchard, we begin to see that some things transcend this dichotomy. What matters to her is not what side someone is on, but that her children are starving. What matters to her is not who killed her husband, but the fact that he is dead. Seeing this clearly is the dawn of an understanding in my students that will ultimately prove to be profound. Radub is satisfied by her answers that Michelle Fléchard is no spy, and this gruff old sergeant is moved to adopt the women and children into the Red Bonnet Battalion. The baby looks up at him and smiles, and we are told, a big tear rolled down his cheek and stopped at the end of his mustache, looking like a pearl. It is an image my students and I pause on, because it is touching, and because by the end of the novel, Radub's unique combination of formidable bravery and tender affection will place him among my students' pantheon of literary heroes. I myself am a little bit in love with him. In the next chapter, we find ourselves far from Radub and the children, watching a general disguised as a peasant board a warship disguised as a merchant vessel. His name, we will later learn, is Marquis de Lantenac, and he is being transported from England to the coast of France, where he will lead the royalist peasant army in the dangerous forest of Vendée. The ship's captain and executive officer discuss the qualities needed in a leader of Vendée and wonder if they will find them in Lantenac. They need, they say, a man like Gaston, who nicely shot 300 blues after making them dig their own graves. Or, like Joly, the clockmaker, whose son was a Republican, and who, when he encountered him in battle, captured him and blew his brains out. They need someone merciless, ferocious, inexorable. Those words, so important to the novel's theme, will come up a lot. Then, their conversation is cut short by what has to be one of the single most dramatic scenes in world literature. When we arrive at it, I always ask my students whether they've ever heard the term loose cannon. They usually have, understanding it to mean someone who's erratic and dangerous in some way. and I tell them that Hugo is about to give them new meaning for the term. I can't possibly do justice to the loose cannon scene without reading you every word, but I'll just try to indicate or remind you of the thrill of it. This iron, many-ton monster, broken from its mooring chain after a gunner improperly fastened it, rolls around the deck of the ship, making holes in the planking, disabling the mast, destroying the other cannons, and killing and mangling countless men. Here is a glimpse of how Hugo describes its devastating and indomitable power. Nothing is more inexorable than the anger of the inanimate. That frenzied mass has the leaps of a panther, the weight of an elephant, the agility of a mouse, the stubbornness of the axe, the unexpectedness of the swelling sea, the swift blows of lightning, the deafness of the tomb. And what is to be done? How can it be overcome? A storm ceases, a cyclone passes, a wind dies down, a broken mast can be replaced, a leak can be stopped, a fire can be extinguished. But what is one to do with that enormous bronze brute? You cannot kill it, for it is dead, and at the same time, it is alive. It lives with the sinister life that comes to it from the infinite. What does this scene do for my students? It is breathtaking, heart-stopping drama that puts to shame any modern action movie formulas. By this point in the novel, my students and I have already talked about how this book would make an epic blockbuster film. I cannot believe it hasn't been done, in no small part because of that scene. One of my life's goals is for a student of mine to write a screenplay of it. And I can already claim that one, who was a student at the University of Southern California Film School, worked on it, but she didn't finish it. The loose cannon is conquered when Marquis de Lantenac, that general in peasant disguise, leaps into action and, with the help of the gunner who had authored the disaster, succeeds in toppling it. Both men heroically put their lives on the line to save the ship and its remaining sailors. The ship's captain then brings the gunner before Lantenac and says, "General, considering what this man has done, don't you think there is something for his commanders to do?" Lantenac unfastens the captain's cross of St. Louis and attaches it to the gunner's jacket, and all the sailors cheer. Then, pointing at the dazzled gunner, he says, "Now have this man shot." We have here, once again, a moment that makes my students, just like many of you did, gasp aloud. They are stunned by this unexpected twist, but that's only the beginning of its impact. Then they are prompted to consider, did he do right? Was his judgment just? Hugo makes them move from the dramatic action into deep contemplation. They're being asked to consider a complex moral question that transcends the everyday. I think of it like spiritual weightlifting. Through concentrated and intensive activity, they're building a capacity to deal more easily with the lighter demands of daily life. Whatever my students' judgment of Lantenac's decision, the captain and first officer's judgment is clear. They declare, "Vendée has a leader." Then the drama builds again. The ship has been irreparably damaged by the loose cannon, and it has drifted off course. The sailors regroup to find themselves between two unconquerable dangers, a reef on which they would founder, and a fleet of enemy ships with 360 cannons to their 9. There is no escape. But the Marquis de Lantenac can't die. They need him to make it to the coast of France. They decide to ask for a volunteer to row him to shore, while the rest resolve to fight, however futile their fight might be. A volunteer emerges, and he and the Marquis de Lantenac board the lifeboat. The scene ends with a Hugo-esque cliffhanger, when the man who has pledged to save him looks Lantenac in the eye and says, "I am the brother of the man you ordered shot." He is armed with a pistol, and he is there, not for rescue, but for revenge. Lantenac, weaponless, has to defend himself only one thing: words. Lantenac's speech is a mini master class in rhetoric. He begins by saying it was not he who killed the man's brother, but rather the brother's own negligence. He asks for a priest, saying his brother had one, and that by killing him without one, he will be causing Lantenac's soul to be lost, and in doing so, will also lose his own. The argument builds slowly, steadily, to a fevered moral pitch. All those men on the ship are dying because of his brother. Their cause is the cause of God, and because of his brother's negligence, God himself is suffering. By taking away God's last resource, he is acting as Satan's first assistant. Lantenac says, because I won't be there, I, who represent the king, hamlets will continue to burn, families to weep, priests to bleed, Brittany to suffer, the king to be in prison, and Jesus Christ to be in distress. And who will have done it? You. But it's your own affair. One of the concerns I voiced at the outset was how insipid, how lifeless, how sophomoric is the language with which kids on their smartphones are constantly confronted. Compare that experience to this. And they are so capable. They love it. They're dazzled by it and moved. But on their own, they don't know where to find it, how to consume it, or what it might be worth to them. They need guides, they need teachers, and they need Hugo. Lantenac's speech succeeds in disarming his enemy. His would-be killer, Halmelo, now swears loyalty to Lantenac, brings him safely to shore, and in doing so delivers the royalists in Vendée their needed leader. If we thought Lantenac was ferocious, inexorable, we soon learn just how far he will go. When he assumes command of the army and they come upon a farm that has been occupied by the Blues, he orders the farm burned and all its occupiers executed. Our plots then cross when we discover that among them is the Red Bonnet Battalion, with the mother and children in their care. When asked what he should do with the women, Lantenac says to shoot them too. When asked what to do with the children, he says to take them hostage. Fortunately for us, Radoub and a few of his men were on a scouting mission, so they survived the massacre. And Michel Fléchard, though shot in the breast, is able to recover in the care of a peasant who takes her in and nurses her wound. Soon after this scene, we are introduced to the man who will be Lantenac's arch-rival. His name is Simordan, and he is an old priest who gave up God and instead espoused humanity. His devotion to the Republic is, like Lantenac's to royalty, inexorable and ruthless. He is described memorably as having the blind certainty of the arrow, which sees nothing but the goal and goes toward it. But, we are told, he has one potential weakness. He once worked in the household of a lord, and as tutor to the lord's grandnephew. He taught this little lord his own liberated ideals. Into the young man's aristocratic brain, he poured the souls of the people. And we are told everything in Simordan that was capable of loving had pounced, so to speak, on that child. He worshipped the boy. After introducing Simordan, Hugo leaves us with another cliff-hanging question. But was such a man vulnerable, even in such an affection? We shall see. So, we have Lantenac on one side, and Simordan on the other. Ruthlessness on behalf of royalty, pitilessness on behalf of the Republic. But we have one more character to meet. He is the general leading the Republican army in Vendée. He's a man known for his intelligence and bravery, and he's reputed to be leading his troops in a superior manner. But Danton, Marat, and Robespierre summon the aid of Simordan because they believe this young general needs supervision. His military talent is formidable, but he's also known for his clemency. According to Marat, he's firm in battle and soft afterward. He's indulgent, he forgives, he spares, he protects nuns, he saves the wives and daughters of aristocrats, he sets prisoners free, he releases priests. So, they want Simordan to go and oversee him, and if he falters, to cut off his head. At the pronouncement of this general's name, Gauvin, Simordan turns deathly pale. In one of those astounding Hugo-esque turns of plot, we learn that the man he has been sent to supervise is his one weakness, that beloved student, the son of his soul, the only person he has ever loved. And more, his arch-nemesis, Lantenac, the general with whom Gauvin must do battle, is Gauvin's great-uncle, in whose household Simordan once served. When this revelation happens, I just pause and grin and wait for my students to recover, because they usually sit for a minute processing with hands on their cheeks and mouths agape. This is some kind of love-hate triangle that Hugo has created. Simordan, summoning that blind certainty of the arrow, accepts the responsibility and goes off into the war-torn woods to assume his place supervising Gauvin. One small thing that happens on the way becomes supremely important to my students. He reaches an inn where he stops to rest and to give his horse some water. The innkeeper warns this stranger not to travel by way of Dole, because there's fighting there, a brutal conflict between the Marquis de Lantenac and the Viscount Gauvin. The risk, he says, is great, and unless it concerns what you hold dearest in the world, something like your son, which we know, of course, it does. As Simordan rides off, the innkeeper cries after him, "Listen to me carefully. If you go by way of Dole, you'll fall into a massacre, so turn right, not left." The chapter then ends very simply, he turned left. Turn left becomes one of our classroom watchwords. We take it to mean turn into danger to defend what you love. Here is how one of my students described her memory of reading these words in an essay she wrote for her college applications. I remember the May afternoon when Miss VanDamme read that line aloud to us, slowly, thoughtfully, with forceful passion, her eyes watering as if it were her own child likely to perish in the French Revolution. As she eloquently deciphered the intricacies of the hostile yet enduringly affectionate relationship Simordan and Gauvin developed despite their opposing views, I found myself wiping tears from my own cheeks. This was not the first or the last time I would cry in literature class that year. For Simordan, turning left meant following his principles and remaining loyal to his loved one despite a great chance of death. For my 8th grade class, the line "turn left" came to mean finding that same strength of character in our lives and staying true to our beliefs. For me, ultimately, the phrase evolved into a reminder to never stop reading and writing and thinking, never to forget those characters who raised me and made me who I am. She and I are still friends today, and I can attest that she has heeded that reminder. Gauvin defeats Lantenac's army at the Battle of Dole, and Lantenac and his men are forced to flee to the Tour Gauvin, the very castle where Simordan had served as Gauvin's teacher. Lantenac brings the hostage children with him, where he will use them as pawns in his negotiation. Lantenac and 18 of his men are holed up in the castle when Gauvin and an army of 4,500 surround it. Imanus, Lantenac's savage and barbaric second-in-command, presents the attacking army with an ultimatum. Either they let the 19 besieged men go free, or he will light a fire that will exterminate the 3 children. Hugo then spends an entire chapter taking us inside the library, where the children are captive, and having us observe them in their blissful, angelic innocence. I always ask my students why we take such time on this departure from the central story, and the answer is always the same. He wants us to fall in love with them, so that we see what is at stake, which we decidedly do. And much like he did in that opening chapter, Hugo is juxtaposing the innocence of childhood with the brutality of war. The ultimatum is refused, and the battle begins, one highlight of which is the heroism of our old friend Radub. Radub comes to his commander to ask for a favor. The favor? to be first into the breach, despite the fact that he will have to crawl on all fours only to arrive in a dark room where 19 men are pointing guns at him from behind a barricade. But he says to his commander, "Sir, if anything happens to one hair on the children's angelic heads, I swear by everything that's sacred that I, Sergeant Radub, will get even with the Eternal Father for it." This is not the first nor the last time that we see that formidable bravery and tender affection of Radub put on dramatic display. My students have their hero. Radub leads the attack, forces the surviving men to flee upstairs, has them cornered, when they are saved by someone who shows them a secret door. But before they escape, Imanus, with wicked vengefulness, starts the fire. At that very moment, Michelle Fléchard, the tirelessly devoted mother who has wandered on bleeding feet through the forest, desperate to find her children, arrives on the scene, sees them in smoke and flames, and screams. The Marquis de Lantenac, who has in his pocket the key to the room that holds them, hears her cry and is forced to make a decision. Will he go free, or will he return and save the children? For once, Lantenac's ruthlessness, inexorability, and mercilessness are triumphed over by his humanity. He goes back into the building, unlocks the door, walks straight into the fire, saves the children, and then is arrested by Simordan. Gauvin then faces a question of similar moral character. Will he reward Lantenac's magnanimity or let him go free and let him go free, or will he keep him captive and sentence him to execution? It is a decision over which he agonizes in a chapter that shows my students what it means to think deeply, to consider carefully, and never to be content with hasty judgments that gloss over complexity and nuance. But Gauvin is the man of clemency. He decides that in saving the children, Lantenac had transfigured himself. He decides that though Lantenac had been terrible, his magnanimity made him majestic. He decides that execution cannot be the reward for heroism. He decides to set Lantenac free. This is precisely the sort of clemency for which Simordan had been sent to punish Gauvin. And now he faces a dreadful moral decision. His is the only one I won't tell you, so I leave something unspoiled in the book. And even without that spoiler, I've already offered enough to reveal Hugo's theme, the one that has such a powerful impact on my students and will leave its mark on anyone who reads this book right. In the battle between monarchy and revolution, between white and blue, between royalty and republic, Hugo's allegiance is clear. He's a lover of liberty, and he is squarely on the revolutionary side. But in this novel, that is not his concern. He's in favor of a republic, but a republic won on what terms, by what means, with what as its guiding principle? Looking back on the Reign of Terror, Hugo is saying, in words he puts in the mouth of his hero Gauvin, that it will be the calumny of the revolution. The transcendence of the mother's concerns, the peacefulness of nature, the innocence of children, the false dichotomy of brutal revolution and brutal royalism, Gauvin's vision of a republic of clemency, all of this comes together into Hugo's theme. I think that theme is perfectly captured in one of Gauvin's reflections. He thinks to himself, above the revolutionary absolute, there is the human absolute. All of Hugo's works are suffused with the spirit of humanity. But here, humanity is at the very heart of his message. Here he is telling us that to be humane is the highest of moral obligations. If I was right in my contention that our children are leading spiritually barren lives, how beautiful a theme is this for them to ponder. If I was right that steeped in social media, they are descending, along with much of society, into compassionless tribalism, becoming unable to transcend cultural divides and find a common humanity? How powerful an idea is this for them to consider? And they do. I will conclude my talk with one final story from the classroom. At my school, the 8th grade students were given an opportunity to do a semester-long independent study project. One of my students spent the semester researching the bombing of Dresden, and for his final presentation, he argued passionately that it should not be considered a war crime despite the devastating death toll, because it was instrumental to the Allies' defeat of Germany. I told him afterward that, being a history buff and a contemplator of moral questions, I was sure he would love 93. I was right. He did. But the whole time he was swept up in the action and consumed by Hugo's message, and he hadn't made a connection to his own project's theme. When we arrived at the line, above the revolutionary absolute, there is the human absolute, I said, "Do you see why I thought you'd like this novel?" He nodded, but I could see that something had not yet clicked. I said, "Do you see how it relates to your independent study project?" It's not possible for me to do justice to what happened then. His eyes got wide. He dropped his face into his hands, and then with his fingers in his hair, he squeezed the sides of his head and said, "Oh my God, I don't know what I think anymore." This spontaneous expression was so earnest and so deeply felt. It was one of the most beautiful moments I've witnessed in my class. It was exemplary of what I call soul stretching. Now, I told him then, and I want to say very clearly now, that my expectation was not that he would change his mind about his conclusion in his project, and that maybe, even after being exposed to Hugo's theme, he would come to the very same conclusion. Whether he did or whether he didn't is not what mattered to me. What mattered is that this novel would have challenged and deepened and given nuance to his understanding. That is the sort of richness of spiritual experience that we ought to be offering our children. And it is my fervent belief that Hugo is one of the single best sources for doing so. Awash in their prosaic and spiritless sea, Hugo can lift our children above the surface, letting them transcend the everyday and see the sublime. He can give them a spiritual compass, helping them to chart their course. He can reveal the grandeur around them, allowing them to feel a reverence for the infinite. And he can focus their gaze on the horizon, inspiring them with belief in a beautiful future. Thank you.